Okay, well, welcome everyone and hello. This is our virtual intellectual community at the Humanities Institute at Stony Brook. And I am Adrián Pérez Melgoza, the Institute's director. And it is really my pleasure to welcome all of you, but certainly our special guest today, Professor Victoria Saramago, who comes to us from Chicago, thanks to Zoom. And we feel privileged to have her here today, and we welcome her dearly and warmly to the Humanities Institute. Our attention to the event today. And events like this are possible because of the work of many people. I would like to highlight the collaboration of the Hispanic Languages and Literature Department in sponsoring this event. And also, of course, Adrian Unger, who has been instrumental in coordinating every detail, from the logistics to the poster. And of course, key has been the work of Professor Javier Uriarte from Hispanic Languages and Literature, who has been working from the moment when it was just an idea until it became a reality today. He will introduce the event and our guest. Let me just briefly say that Javier Uriarte is an associate professor in the Department of Hispanic Languages and Literature. His book, The Desert Makers, Travel, War, and the State in Latin America, performs a comparative study of the role that war played in the processes of state consolidation in the Southern Cone during the 19th century. The Spanish version of his book won the Uruguay's National Prize for the Best Unpublished Literary Essay. His second book, now in progress, is entitled Fluvial Poetics in the Amazon, a wonderful title, Displacement, Infrastructure, Modernization, and it studies the cultural imaginary that emerges among Amazonian peoples and also those of travelers, politicians, and intellectuals in the region. We feel fortunate to have Javier as a friend, as a frequent collaborator of the Institute. And Javier, welcome, and thank you for organizing this. And please join me in welcoming Javier.
Hello, thanks a lot, Adrián. Well, I'm very happy to be here with you today. Thank you very much to you, to Adrián, and to the Humanities Institute in general. I think this activity, this series, for all the program you put together and the importance of everything the Institute does for the university and for the community, especially in these difficult times. It's very important for all of us working in the humanities to keep collaborating. And I'm very happy that I think this pressing matters is a great idea as a speaker series, and I like the idea that we get together to talk about things that are important to most of us today, that we are worried about, that we're concerned with, and that conversation has students as the focus, right? The main focus, that they have the opportunity to get to know the work of important colleagues and activists, chat with them. So I hope we can do that today. So I'm gonna introduce Victoria, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the course that it is the context of which this talk is a part, in a way, right? Okay. So I'm very happy to have here Victoria. It's the second time that she visits Stony Brook, and she's one important voice in doing a very innovative work in the field of environmental humanities. So it's for me a pleasure to work with her, and I hope to continue doing so. So Victoria Saramago is an assistant professor of Hispanic and Luso-Brazilian Studies at the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures at the University of Chicago. She has a PhD degree from Stanford University, as well as an MA and BA degrees from the State University of Rio de Janeiro. Her work covers 20 covers 20th and 21st century Latin American literatures with a focus on environmental studies. Her book that we're going to discuss here today with you, Fictional Environments, Mimesis, Deforestation and Development in Latin America, and which was published actually this year, demonstrates that literature can help us make sense of environmental change by showing how novels have inspired conservationist initiatives and offered counterpoints to developmentalist policies, and how environmental concerns have informed novelist agendas in their work as essayists, politicians, and public intellectuals. Fictional Environments received an honorable mention for the Antonio Cândido Prize, the Brazil Section Prize of the Latin American Studies Association. She is also the author of O Duplo do Pai, O Filho e a Ficção de Cristóvão Teza, which was published in 2013, and her articles have appeared or are forthcoming in Novel, a Forum on Fiction, Luso-Brazilian Review, Ecozone, European Journal of Literature, Culture and Environment, and others. I thank a lot Victoria for being here, and I ask you to join me in welcoming her to our conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier. Yeah, I want to start by thanking Javier for the invitation, for the long dialogue and collaborations. I want to thank Adrian and Adrienne for the invitation as well, and for all of you at the Humanities Institute for having me here today, and for all the logistic support to make this event happen. And I want to thank you all for being here in this Zoom land where we can have so many people from different places together dialoguing, and I think that's one of the beautiful things of having these virtual meetings. So I'm also very happy to give this talk as part of Javier's course. And as we were talking a couple of days ago, this will hopefully allow me to do a little bit of a hybrid format in which I'm going to mostly focus on my book, on the first chapter of my book, in fact, but will also give us some more time to talk a little bit about the novel, Grande Sertão Veredas, The Devil Should Pay in the Backlands, as well as, give you guys a couple of thoughts about the history of the term sertão in Brazil and in the Lusophone world. And hopefully we'll have the time to read a couple of longer passages from the novel. So today I'm going to start by talking very briefly about the main proposal. Oh, now I realize that I really should have started my PowerPoint presentation.
So Victoria, can I say just one thing?
Please.
Sorry, because I forgot about saying what was the course about, right?
Oh,
I was gonna say that and I forgot. Sorry for the interruption, but I'm briefly gonna say that Victoria is actually, this is the end of our course, right? And we are going to close the course reading Grande Sertão Veredas, and this has been a course focused on the literature of Argentina and Brazil, and particularly on the ways in which the Pampas and the Sertão have been represented in canonical works from those two countries. So we have been reading different types of works, but trying to discuss the issues of space and place, the relationships that these spaces have had with projects of national consolidation and national construction, and with the ways in which the environment is conceived, and the relationship between humans and the environment is also discussed here, right? So I'm sorry for the interruption. I just wanted to give the context for her talk. So we have been reading lots of canonical Brazilian works that deal with this space, And we are, as we would say in Spanish, this is the broche de oro, right? To close the course, but we have been having several discussions about issues that will be mostly here very present in Victoria's talk. My apologies, Victoria, and now.
No worries, Javier. Thank you for giving everybody more context about the course. And yeah, what I want to do here, at least in terms of how we understand literary representation or mimesis, is to take the reverse direction. So how can we think not only about how literary works represent certain environments, but how can we think, especially in the case of a novel such as Grande Sertão Veredas, how can the very referential reality, how can the real spaces where these novels are set try to somehow recreate or reconstruct the fictional settings? So how can we think about mimesis as a two-way process in a couple of events, of examples? Okay. So yeah, so I'm going to start by talking quickly about my book, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the chapter, talk a bit about the novel itself, and then I'm going to go back to the chapter and talk about some initiatives in the northwest of Minas Gerais that have been highly influenced by Grande Sertão Veredas. Okay, so this is the cover of my book. Yeah, that came out recently, and by Northwestern University Press. I think the name of the publisher is not visible here. And Fictional Environments, Mimesis, Deforestation and Development in Latin America, investigates how fictional works have become sites for the production of knowledge about, imaginations of, and also, especially in the case of the first chapter, interventions in Latin American environments. I focus on this period of accelerated urbanization and deforestation from the 1940s to the 1960s, when you have a number of developmentalist policies being developed across Latin America. And I argue that the five authors and the respective novels that that I focus on in my book impact the perception of actual social and environmental transformations. So I examine in this book, for example, how novels have inspired the establishment of protected areas, such as National Park, we're going to talk about that today, have offered a counterpoint to desires for agricultural modernization and urbanization, and have, in one counterintuitive case, Mario Vargas Llosa advocated against indigenous land rights. My book seeks to show that entanglements between the trajectories of fictional works and the fates of the environments they depict over the decades, when considered in this methodological light, prompt us to re-examine the interplay between textual realism and referential reality. So we have this increasing gap between the way in which we imagine certain environments and the perception of the environmental change, mostly environmental loss in the case of deforestation. I know that you other events in the Institute have been focusing on the Amazon, which is really a very dramatic case to think about the imaginative impact of deforestation, right? I would risk saying that, the increasing gap between these perceived realities can be quite painful to accept if the changes faced by referential reality are not seen as advantageous or desirable. And I would risk saying that in few moments is this change more painfully perceived than in environmental issues as they are conceived today. So deforestation, pollution, water contamination, species extinction, unruled urbanization, and climate change, these are all parts of this threatening vocabulary that populate our 21st century lives, right? While we have pastoral fictions that have for centuries offered an untainted, idyllic counterpoint to the life of the cities. We can think, for example, of Raymond Williams in The Country and the City. So I would say that the intensified sense of loss that we have today and the imminent danger that climate change brings us has been giving more dramatic tones to this contrast. So I want to propose in this talk that more than a respite and a representation of what reality once was, fiction has been seen in some specific cases, such as Grande Sertão Veredas, as a true parameter of what reality should be. So this may result in the development of concrete projects whose objective is to make referential reality, so reality mimic or imitate fictional worlds in order to produce environmental recovery or conservation. So in this talk, I will focus more specifically in these areas in the northwestern portion of Minas Gerais. Here. And more specifically, I want to discuss with you all the impact of this very influential, extremely canonical novel that came out in 1956, Grande Sertão Veredas, translated as The Devil to Pay in the Backland, signed by João Guimarães Rosa. And I want to bring some initiatives that constitute efforts to preserve social, cultural, and environmental realities using Guimarães Rosa's work as a kind of parameter. So these projects seek to celebrate and maintain a certain view of the Brazilian backlands or the Sertão, necessarily in conflict with the sharp transformations in the region. I'm going to bring some images in a moment. Sometimes they offer pragmatic approaches to the environmental problems faced by the region, such as the Projeto Monozone, but sometimes they offered an idealized gaze that turns away from what does not fit into the frames of Guimarães Rosa's landscape, such as the case of the touristic circuit. In one way or another, these projects point out to the permanence of an environmental imagination, classical term in eco-criticism coined by Lawrence Buell, that is based on fiction that resists and sometimes denies the transformations that have been taking place in the region since the novel's publication. So by different means, these initiatives intervene upon this region in order to make it look more like the novel. While, of course, these cultural and environmental projects would not necessarily depend on a fictional framework to exist, the fact that they do bring Guimarães Rosa's work as a framework challenges our notion of literary representation as a one-way process. So my question is, how can we think about these projects that try to bring the fictional environments to the reality of that region as a problem of literary theory, and not only as a problem of environmental management? So here we have Grande Sertão Veredas. It is a large book, one of the longest books of the Brazilian canon, as Javier's students will probably have noticed, right? And it's also a book that is quite challenging in the sense that it doesn't have any subdivisions. It doesn't have chapters, sections. It only has paragraphs. And in this book, we have the farmer bandit and now farmer Riobaldo telling the story of his life to an educated man from a big city. So we have many different plots that are developed in many novelistic genres that are explored. Everything seems to fit in this big backlands, right? This Grande Sertão, where the novel is set. So you, Javier's students, but also readers of Grande Sertão Veredas, will most likely have noticed the novel's dazzling geographical web that is shaped by Riobaldo's constant travel, sometimes with his group, sometimes by himself. We're talking about around 500 different toponyms and a geography that in many senses akin. So to read Grande Sertão Veredas is almost like to enter this labyrinth, right, of toponyms and also of many different plots. This is something that I develop in another article. We can talk about that later. Anyways, so we have this excess of toponyms, displacements, and also unknown localities. The Sertão emerges in this case as a powerful term that encompasses not only the immensity and this kind of independent existence of the novel's space, but also provides a space for what Guimarães Rosa calls a metaphysics of language to unfold. So we have a problematic interdependence of the documentary and the metaphysical concerns, in the sense that we have a large body of information about the sertão, historical information, geographical, botanic, and etc. But at the same time, the sertão is this place that stands for the world, right? There's this existential, almost metaphysical dimension in Guimarães Rosa's terms of this space, as it is narrated by Guimarães Rosa in this novel. And this interdependence of these two components makes the figure of the sertão emerge as capable of unifying and absorbing the array of apparently divergent conceptions of poetic creations at stake in the author's statements. So we can think, for example, in the interview Guimarães Rosa gave to Gunther Lorenz in 1965, in which Guimarães Rosa says, and I quote, "I carry the sertão with me, and the world where I live is also sertão. I believe Goethe was, in a word, the only great poet of world literature that did not write for his day, but for the infinite. He was a Backlander, a sertanejo." End of quote. So by configuring this door to the infinite, the sertão would provide a living condition for literature that would also include figures that, you know, at least historically speaking, would not be from the backland, such as the German author Goethe. So we have all this vocabulary of infinity in Guimarães Rosa's work, but it actually draws upon a much larger history of the term sertão in Lusophone cultures that in fact goes beyond Brazil. The term sertão has been used also in Africa and Asia under Portuguese colonial framework. And in general, the sertão is an umbrella term for everything that in the colonial period was beyond the frontier of colonization. And that in the case of Brazil, after the independence, usually refers to inland territories that have not been urbanized and that have, where the Central Powers have not really established themselves very clearly. So it's very interesting to think that, you know, today when I think about sertão, we talk mostly about this area in the backlands of the states of the region of Northeast, right? But in fact, many places, the Amazon was called sertão, right? In fact, even in the 20th century, some suburbs of Rio de Janeiro, which is one of the biggest cities in the country, were called sertões, right? And the sertão that we are talking about is a sertão that is kind of here. This is the state of Minas Gerais, and this is where most of Guimarães Rosa's works take place in this area. So it's important to keep in mind that sertão in this case is rather a relational term. It's not a fixed category that usually refers to something that is beyond this arc of colonization, right? And Antônio Robert de Moraes calls it a geographical ideology. I think that's a very good way of defining it. And the sertão resists exploration while being constantly about to be explored and absorbed by urbanization. So when areas are when they become urban areas, or when there is agricultural activity, usually they stop being called sertão, right? So this is why Haruf Salmen Spíndola defines the sertão, and I quote, as the landscape built to be extinguished, end of quote. So is this area that is eventually going to be incorporated into into an urban perimeter and all that, but that still keeps this kind of imagination of alterity attached to it. And in the case of Grande Sertão Veredas, it appears often as this kind of isolated, self-dependent microcosmos that is most of the times opposed to the attempts by the federal government to enter in it. This happens a lot in the military cases. After all, Grande Sertão Veredas is also a novel about war, but also happens a lot in the environmental sense. So, and I wanted to bring to you the Sertão of Minas Gerais here, that in many cases in the imagination related to Guimarães Rosa and, you know, there's more like traditional forms of thinking about this area. You have the veredas, which are these little oases with buriti trees that are very present in Guimarães Rosa's work. And, you know, this is like a house, so you can see this very rural kind of almost pastoral landscape. But in fact, since the 1970s, and especially in the 21st century, this area has been mostly taken by plantations. This is the case of a plantation of soy, for example, which is widespread in the Cerrado, which is this larger biome to where this area belongs, or plantations of eucalyptus, for example. You can see here from above and from front, and there are huge areas taken by these and other extensive monocultures. So it's important to, I invite us to keep in mind these images as we think about the way in which the Sertão of Guimarães Rosa has persisted in our imagination. So I have a few passages here. Javier, I don't know if it's better to read them now or to go back to them later. I don't want to take too much time. What do you think?
I don't know. Whatever you think it's better for. Yeah, we can come back later to them if you want. But
maybe we can come back to them later. Yeah, I would love to read them with you and comment them, but I'm afraid that it may take too much time. And okay, so please remind us to go back to these passages at the end. Yeah, especially this one is pretty long. Okay, but these passages basically bring to us a sense in which the Sertão is a place that does not close itself. It's this kind of open space where you can walk a long time without seeing almost anyone, right? And it's a place that is everywhere. El sertón está en todas partes. I was going to read it in Portuguese, but many people read it in Spanish. But at the same time, it's interesting to notice that together with these very vivid descriptions of the sertão and the names of like animals, of plants, of like places, you also already start having some sense of environmental change in Grande Sertão Veredas himself. So for example, in this paragraph, you have this beautiful description of the sertão, very attached to the emotional attachment of Riobaldo to the character of Diadorim. But at the end, he talks about saudade, how he misses the sertão, ignorância de coração, and then he says that the government is starting to open a road from Pirapora to Paracatu. So, you know, this kind of sign of environmental change, when Riobaldo tells his story, which already happens kind of in the present of the narrative, gives us a sense that what is waiting ahead in the future of the novel already includes a good amount of environmental change. So urban growth, economic integration on state and national levels, the building of roads, election of lawmakers from the Sertão, entrepreneurial initiatives, increasing presence of legal actors such as soldiers, judges, or policemen. All these factors are present in the novel, and they suggest the Sertão's eventual extinction in a future that is not told in the story, but that remains put in the state of potentiality. So my hypothesis in this chapter is that this extensive reflection upon the potentialities and limits of the Sertão that Guimarães Rosa articulates in Grande Sertão Veredas and other moments of his works had an impact on the perception of the referential Sertão of Minas Gerais. So we have here a fictional space that draws upon the past reality of Minas Gerais. She starts mostly in the República Velha, the turn of the 20th century, but also projects itself back onto the present reality of the novel in the area and of our 21st century reality if you think about the novel's reception history. In other words, we have the recovery of the fictional landscape of the Rosian Sertão in the referential area where it has been set. And this is a significant component in the development of social and environmental projects in the region. But we also have to ask ourselves, so could any novel have an impact on reality, right? And I would say that no. And when we think about the Grande Sertão Veredas' specificity and its potential to have the type of impact that I will show to you guys in a moment, we also need to take into consideration how this novel was not only canonical, but how it establishes the literary criticism on Grande Sertão Veredas establishes a vocabulary of universality. Grande Sertão Veredas, and you can see especially in the early criticism and like up to the 1980s and still today, how there was almost an obsession of thinking of Grande Sertão Veredas as a novel of universal contours, or as a novel that would bring a universal dimension to this distinctively regional setting. So of course, Brazil already had a large body of regional literature on which Guimarães Rosa was drawing upon heavily. And the Sertão also appears as this author of modernization, right? And this compound between this radical affirmation of universality and regionalism at the same time is complicated by this mystical metaphysical dimension, right? And all of that contributes to this rhetoric of universality that was developed by the critical corpus of Grande Sertão Veredas. When we think about this vivid contours of inexhaustible profusion associated with the Grande Sertão Veredas, we can think of how Guimarães Rosa's work reconfigures Minas Gerais Sertão in what Jacques Derrida has called the distribution of the sensible, quoting, Jacques Rancière, distribution of the sensible, quoting Rancière, which is a general law that defines the forms of partaking by first defining the modes of perception in which they are inscribed, end of quote. In this case, literature would be able to do politics as literature in as much as by being involved, and I quote, in this partition of the visible and the sayable, end of quote, it allows the appearance of some specific data in the common sphere of experience. And this is the nature of Guimarães Rosa's work in shaping the Minas Gerais Sertão. I want to propose that when Guimarães Rosa and the whole body of criticism makes this region visible and sayable in this cluster of perceptions and practices of which politics is composed, according to Rancière, Guimarães Rosa gives the space for a political subjectification of Guimarães Rosa's Sertão. Certainly, the politics of the aesthetic dimension of Guimarães Rosa is intertwined with the prestige this work has had in the literary market, which has decisively contributed to the reconfiguration of Minas Gerais Sertão in the partition of the sensible. So basically, Guimarães Rosa's work gives us the sense that this region is precious and somehow should be preserved, right? I think that considering the critical history of this novel really helps us understand its sphere of influence today. Because if we think of the universality of the Sertão, it depends on this visibility and maintenance of the specific characteristics of the region to exist. In other words, this is space of immensity of profusion, with the Buriti River, with the Buriti trees, the rivers, the farms, the cattle, they need to be visible as such in order to keep visible the universality of Rosian landscapes. But how do we keep this reality visible in a place as the Sertão, that, going back to Espíndola's words, is built to be extinguished? Since the novel's publications, we have seen some major transformations, right? I have showed you the plantations of soy eucalyptus, and of course we can think about the inauguration of Brasilia only 4 years after the publication of the novel, that attracted many people to the central plateau of Brazil, and was like a magnet of population. Monocultures of soy, orange eucalyptus, there is the Três Marias Dam, the growth of cities, many of which are mentioned in the novel, such as Corinto, Curitiba, Januária, Pirapora, and the arrival of southern migrants to what would be roughly the Liso do Sussuarão, known now as Chapada Gaúcha. all of these transformations must be taken into consideration, right? At the same time, it's interesting to notice that when we think about most of these projects, they take place in a moment like from the end of the military dictatorship in 1985 to the present, right? So, as I said before, these projects do not really depend on Guimarães Rosa's work to exist, but they use his works as a form of symbolic justification for their existence. So now I'm going to talk about the projects, finally, right? The first one is the Guimarães Rosa touristic circuit. Then I'm going to talk about the Monozone project. And finally, the Grande Sertão Veredas National Park. So this is the sign for the touristic circuit. We have indeed many modalities of literary tourism surrounding the works of Guimarães Rosa since the foundation of the Guimarães Rosa House Museum in 1974. And then we have the Academy of Letters of Cordisburgo, his home birth town, that started sponsoring since 1989 the Rosian Weeks, which are annual cultural festivals that combine talks with plays, concerts, artworks, craftsmanship, and book fairs. And we have eco-literary hikes that visit places present in Guimarães Rosa's works. But it is in the early 2000s that this tourism around Guimarães Rosa took a decisive turn with the creation of the Guimarães Rosa touristic circuit. It was created in 2003 and sponsored by the Minas Gerais State Tourist Office since 2005. And it became more popular, especially in 2006, which marked the 50th anniversary of the novel's publication. So it gathers basically a number of towns in the region in a joint effort to increase literary tourism. So they provide information, maps, routes, supports and publicizes events and groups related to Guimarães Rosa, such as the Rosian Weeks, the Miguelins group, the Pathways to the Backlands group. Here we have the touristic circuit in the Casa de Cultura. So we can see through these initiatives how the circuit has been developing steadily the literary perception of the region's geography. Perhaps the major challenges that we see here is to make the geography of Guimarães Rosa and his landscape coexist with all those transformations that I was telling you about, then that the region has been living throughout the decades. So the tourist basically needs to adjust their eyes in order to face these transformations and conciliate them with the literary tourism, with the Rosian landscapes. So you can see, for example, some of those toponyms that did not really exist at the time of the novel's publication, such as Presidente Juscelino, right? But you also have imaginary toponyms, Rio do Sussuarão, and places that are present in both literary and cultural units. The map is to help identify the geographical areas where mostly
Victoria, can I say something? I think you're touching the microphone of the.
Oh, I'm sorry.
With the paper you're reading, and it makes a noise. Weird.
Thank you. Sorry for that. Thanks for letting me know, Javier. And at the same, so yeah, you have all these toponyms from different moments, some of them real, some of them not. And at the same time, you have these cows' heads. You can see here drawing a path that corresponds to the path taken by the author in a trip he did in 1952. And then you also have this kind of Buriti trees scattered in the map that evoke the style of Pochi, the visual artist who drew the cover of the novel's second edition. And there are indeed many Buriti trees today, as well as large areas devoted to cattle raising. But if you see this map, you cannot really see an indication of plantations of soy, eucalyptus, and orange, right? Which is something that, of course, you will find if you travel to the area. Instead, the map and the information on the website talks about these more traditional elements. So I quote here a short description. Through the paths of the sertão, we can appreciate the art and invention of the sertanejo's lifestyle, the sound of guitars and horns, the traditional religious and popular parties, horseback rides, boat trips in the São Francisco River, chapels and farms, local coffee, anecdotes, stories, and beautiful literary walks with storytellers that narrate episodes from the works of João Guimarães Rosa. End of quote. So in many senses, this description is not inaccurate. Many places, peoples, and traditions to some extent can still be found. It's not as if the circuit aimed at completely recreating the sertão in an independent fashion as a hyper-reality, we can think, the sense that Umberto Eco defines the term, and I quote, as an obsession about the creation of a real copy of the reality being represented, end of quote. Instead, what the touristic circuit proposes is would be the traveler's willingness to ignore the elements of today's sertão that do not fit into Guimarães Rosa's universe and emphasize on the aspects that remained. So this leads us to the development of a biased gaze where elements perceived as Rosian or traditional would be maintained, whereas the signs of environmental degradation would be discarded and ignored. So this is the circuit. Now I'm going to talk about the Projeto Monozone project, which is like another major and complex example. The name comes from Manuel Nardi, nicknamed Manuelzão, who was a real vaqueiro, a rancher that Guimarães Rosa met during his travels, and they became friends. And also Monozone appears in Guimarães Rosa's fiction, not in Grande Sertão Veredas, but in other works. And Monozone himself, he was alive when the project was created in 1997 and supported the project until his death a few months after. So the project was launched by the School of Medicine. So we're talking here about another type of institutional space of the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And it aimed initially at improving sanitary conditions in the Rio das Velhas Basin through the promotion of depollution, preventative health, and environmental education initiatives. But then it has expanded its scope tremendously and became a multidisciplinary project with partnerships and with other institutions, as well as state and municipal governments. So we have, for example, activities of biomonitoring, geoprocessing, recovery of ciliary woods. There are also the Núcleos Monozone, that are local councils that propose forums of discussion related to water management, environmental education, public policies. And also you have an environmental education that is central to the project and runs a series of initiatives for teachers and students in the region. And also, and you have like the cultural branch with some cultural festivals that have been organized. So the idea of the Monozone project is not to ignore the changes, the environmental changes in the region, but rather to focus on researching them, bring them to public attention, and to propose or develop interventions. In this sense, the Sertão of Guimarães Rosa is activated by the project and serves symbolically as the environmental perimeter based on which the project acts. Monozone brings together the fictional Sertão of Guimarães Rosa, but also the transformations of today's referential Sertão. And Guimarães Rosa, Monozone was 4 years older than Guimarães Rosa, but outlived him in 30 years and saw the landscape change in ways that the author himself might have trouble imagine. So in the first issue of the Revista Monozone, the Monozone magazine, we see, for example, I'm going to quote a passage from the medicine professor and coordinator of the project, Apolo Edinger Lisboa, that explains the choice of Monozone as the project patron. I quote, Monozone lived in the Sertão of Minas Gerais, know the region before the woodcuts for coal production for steel mills, and before the generalized deforestation to plant eucalyptus, soy, and other extensive monocultures. He condemned this type of progress without conservation that extinguishes local lakes, trees, and fauna, disfiguring its natural characteristics and the sertanejo way of life. The language of another sertanejo, João Guimarães Rosa, is completely permeated by the relationship between man and nature. And the storyteller Monozone embodied this situation in language. He knew the oasis of the Big Sertão and the force of the São Francisco's river's water with its fish, and he did not accept the destruction of these ecosystems, end of quote. So we have the situation in the northwestern sertões of Minas Gerais that is materialized in the figure of Monozone, who represents a kind of threshold between the past and the present of the sertões, between the fictional character and a reminder of his referential persona brings regarding the real extinction of the sertões that will remain present in fiction. So Monozone works as something like an ambassador of an existing fictional reality and a lost environment in a project that is very much aware of the environmental changes in the region. Finally, the Grande Sertão Veredas National Park, it was created in 1989 amidst the country redemocratization and a few months after Brazil's current constitution was made effective. And it has a unique mission, which is to emulate this landscape present in the narrative, right? The name of the park is the name of the novel. An objective but this objective expressed not only in the park's name, but is also repeated in official documents and reports. So you can think, for example, about the management plan. That was a document, a very important document, produced in 2003, and that provides an extensive report about the region's history and geophysical characteristics, flora, fauna, but also the policies and the directions to be taken in the future. And also the relocation of the people who lived in the park's area before the park's creation. So it's very interesting when you read the management plan, which is pretty much a technical document, right? To see the number of mentions to Guimarães Rosa, and its role in the park's inception and development. So, for example, in the section that is named Description of the Influence Area, the report notes, and I quote, that this whole region is widely quoted in Guimarães Rosa's work, Grande Sertão Veredas. And then it says that the novel setting in northwestern Minas Gerais, and more specifically the savannas, cerrados, of the right and left banks of the São Francisco rivers, whose typologies are found almost completely preserved in the national park. So it's really a talk about preserving the fictional environments in the reality of the national park, right? So it's interesting to notice that in spite of this attentive gaze to the region's referential and fictional pasts, the very category of national park, Unidade de Conservação, conservation unit, prevents the existence of local populations in the area, which are very much present in the novel, right? And the removal of these local populations is only a recent episode of a series of restrictions in access to land that has been lived since the 1970s by the veredeiros, as the local population are called. Geraldo Nelson Martins showed this process very well. So when the park was created, also the population who lived in the area had to be removed and relocated outside of the park's area, usually in areas that had lower water supplies, so they were not as good as the park's area. So we have this long process behind the establishment of the park and the destiny of the veredeiros that underscores this conflictive relationship of local populations and conservation areas. On the one hand, the national park aims to recover the physical characteristics of the region prior to the changes that have been taking place since the 1970s. But on the other, national parks are par excellence spaces without human dwellers. So the park aims at recreating an original landscape that has actually two contrastive origins. The first one is a time before the area started being shaped by human activity, and the other one is the time of the novel. So between these two objectives, The veredeiros are caught between them, and their presence shows how problematic it is to imitate a fictional landscape marked by human presence that is present in the very concept of national park. In this sense, it's curious that the management plan devotes a lot of attention to local cultures, to describing them, at the same time as it narrates the process of their removal from the park's area. And here is like one of the trails that has been opened recently in 2015 that has some signs with passages from Grande Sertão Veredas. So you have the inscription of the fictional Sertão into the real one, which is part of the touristic experience of the park. So to conclude, we may ask how Guimarães Rosa's works are capable of influencing these initiatives, right? After all, many people may not have read his work in order to engage with these initiatives and participate in them, right? In fact, it would be not surprising if most of the workers involved in these projects had not read Guimarães Rosa's work. Yet, his works act upon these local realities that interfere on them. More than that, they intend to make these realities not only improve from a social and environmental perspective, but it's also their intention to let these realities imitate the fictional sertão. And here I arrive at this concept, the idea of this twofold process in which we have this de-aestheticization of Guimarães Rosa's work that leads to this environmental change through this project, but they result in a re-aestheticization brought by a gaze of today's sertão that is shaped by the same projects. If we think, for example, about agency and thinking about Alfred Yale's terminology in art and agency, the book Grande Sertão Veredas is capable of taking on the role of a social agent, which implies precisely to provisionally abstract its aesthetic dimension in favor of a more diplomatic function of negotiating social and environmental frameworks. And the novel acts in this situation less as a literary work to be read than as an object imbued of a certain power, almost a magical power, back to Yale's terminology, leveraged by the label of universal that the author has received and that inspires and sets the standards for actions upon referential reality. So in these three cases, these three projects that I showed to you today, the influencing Guimarães Rosa's work over the area is there is a corresponding influence in the other direction, in which the attempts at keeping the sertão as it was indeed brings forms of experiencing it on an aesthetic level. The admirers of Guimarães Rosa's works, who are especially, but not exclusively, his readers, may seek what we could think of as a third space, to use Edward Sorge's concept, that brings together fictional, imagined, and referential realities into a whole, whose parts constantly demand a negotiation. In a region marked by a firm expansion of monoculture, as well as mechanized agriculture, industrial activity, urbanization, and etc., this imagined reconstruction of the sertão is not only necessary, but increasingly challenging. These and other initiatives put into relief the extent to which today's sertão performs this complex mimesis of the Rosian sertão to the many travelers that still wish to see these landscapes they read in fictional works, as well as those who will never go to the area and perhaps not even read Guimarães Rosa's books, but still wish to believe and imagine in the current existence of a sertão as the one portrayed by Guimarães Rosa. So the rationale behind these projects exposed here is that Guimarães Rosa fiction sets the parameters of reality for actual areas corresponding to it. It is reality that has to adjust to what our idea of what the sertões of Minas Gerais are, and not the other way around. To conclude, the social agency Rosian works have been performing in desperate, hopeful, maybe even naive attempts to keep the sertão alive has been yielding this number of concrete consequences, such as the projects I explained here, while simultaneously trying to bring together the other side of a rift only bound to grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victoria.
Thank you. I hope it was not too long.
No, it was great. It was great. It's a great overview of many ideas that are very present in our class and well, the type of work you do. So I thought when I was thinking of the dynamics of our conversation here, that a good way to begin talking, and then we're gonna move to the quotes you were proposing too, right? I asked, yeah, no, but they're pertinent, I think. But I asked one of the students in the class, Paulo Suarez, to begin our conversation, give some remarks after your talk, ask some questions, so that we can open the conversation, and after that, also the public can intervene. So, Paulo, are you there?
Hi, nice to see everyone. Reading, that's not something that I'm used to. So that's just me, right? So that's a work that deals with how fictional works can become sites of knowledge about imaginations and interventions. Imaginations that can crystallize time and space in some sense, that can create the task of hollow preservation in some cases, a kind of movement that could actually create the discrepancy and the kind of situation when the preserved is a copy of a fiction, expelling the real verdadeiros, probably the ones closer to the original desire of representation that has moved Guimarães' Rosa fictional intent in the first place. There is an important discrepancy within the complex mimetic relationship between the temporalities inside Grande Sertão. The Grande Sertão National Park and the actual territory that owns, and in some manner, still does its operated as a sertão. A discrepancy that points out as our societies have been imaginatically filled with fiction, as a way to understand and communicate the world through language is formed and is forming by some of the same structures that share the same matter as fiction. Saramago's works compels us to think about the effects of fiction on reality. More than just in its readers, it's about how it generates and promotes the imaginarium that was its origin. It changes what's being represented in some way. Clearly aware of that, this work deals with the mimesis problems, arguing that rather than disappearing or being depicted, referential reality may remain a spectral presence throughout the work's reception history. And following Luis Costa Lima's work, it argues that mimesis is the productions of difference against a background of similitude. Mimesis makes evident the shadows, the unperceived sides of reality that are at once revealed and called into question by the representational object. Finally, I would like to highlight the connection between the affect, the fiction, and the political response. Saramago shows us as nostalgia is a big deal in the way that some particular readings of the fictional can produce effect in the world. Even non-readings apparently can produce an equivalent effect, since the deformation of idealized land that should be able to escape time should be preserved, even when that same imaginary was built over the idea of losing it, which is the case of Grande Sertão Veredas. This kind of investigation, finally, it's important for us because it can bring us the evidence brings to evidence the structures underlying our processes of constituting time and space, the way in which us as a society understand our agency over the world.
Thank you, Paulo. I think one of the things interesting you mentioned is the issue of time also, right? But I let Victoria say some, make some remarks about this. And
thank you, Javier, and thank you very much, Paulo, for your comments. Yeah, well, there are a few things. So yeah, nostalgia, which is something I did not really dwell on in this presentation, but that it is fairly important in my book. I think it is also a term that remains active and that permeates all of the initiatives that we have here, right? And the idea that fictional works can provide us a view that can fuel nostalgia is very important in my work in general, and more specifically in this chapter. When in the first chapter of the book, I talk also about the nostalgia and about the transformative potential of nostalgia that does not need to carry only like a reactionary undertones, right? Which is a commonly perceived side effect of this kind of nostalgic reactions. As Jennifer Ladino has shown, and she shows also how nostalgia, especially in this kind of environmentally inspired types of nostalgia, they can really inspire some concrete initiatives. And I think the ones that I exposed here are a good example of that. And when we think about these initiatives, I propose to think of them as problems of literary theory, but I do not propose to think of them as problems as kind of pure mimetic initiatives, right? So many of them, they select the portions of the novel that are more interesting for their purposes, either commercial purposes or environmental purposes. And so it's something that I ended up by not talking much in my talk, but that is that I would invite you to take into consideration how we are talking about many different objectives that sometimes are conflictive when we talk about the novel, about the literary criticism and the history of reception of the novel, but also about the diverse objectives of those who want to, increase the commercial and touristic activity in the area, as opposed to those who want to work on water management and those who are working in conservation. So we have a multiplicity of ways of thinking about what Grande Sertão Veredas is and can do. And thank you. I think your remarks also highlighted that.
Do we have a? I'm thinking to have some more ideas to keep talking, but I would like to see if someone in the public or in the class has. So we have a question here in the chat, which I don't see. Yeah, so a question from Christine. She asks, thanks, how do novels portray the forces behind the transformation at different levels of the sertão? I think maybe this is a good moment to go back to the quotations, or because you were talking a little bit about that before, right?
Yeah, if you want, or maybe we can continue the debate and then go to the quotations. Thank you, Christine, for your question. Yeah, so I understand that you're talking about novels in general and not just Grande Sertão Veredas. Well, I would say that the term sertão, it's very elusive, and it can really mean different things. When we think about the sertão, as it has many times been characterized as this kind of order of modernization, it's very easy to overlook the many transformations that were taking place, even in the novels that portray the sertão as a more traditional space, right? So even if you think about, going beyond the novelistic realm to a work such as Os Sertões, the Backlands, or Rebellion in the Backlands by Euclides da Cunha, you have a historical awareness of the processes that have been shaping that society that is very much in Euclides da Cunha's work portrayed as barbarian, right, as completely opposed to the civilization of the coast, but that nevertheless is not some kind of originary landscape or originary society that has a history of its own. It's interesting to think about Euclides da Cunha, this trace a bit of this history, even while keeping this opposition between, civilization and barbarism, right, to bring back this common trope. in Latin American intellectual history. So the case of Guimarães Rosa is not different in the sense, we have this society and this environment that are very much felt and were also felt in the history of the reception of this novel as different from the urban spaces of Rio de Janeiro, of São Paulo, for example. So that this opposition and this kind of independent existence of the sertão of Minas Gerais is very much affirmed in the novel. But at the same time, we talk about a novel that does take into consideration a series of transformations of the sertão that go much further than the easy opposition that we may think at first when we think about the sertão as simply the other of modernization, right? So you can think, for example, about the many foreigners that appear in Grande Sertão Veredas, and the immigration routes that are implied in the activity of those foreigners. You can think, for example, about the presence of soldiers and also about the internal conflicts between the jagunços. We could translate that as bandits, as having a history that is also a history of social transformation, but to a certain extent, a history of environmental transformation. So, yeah, I don't know if I have answered your question. It's a question that really invites a very long response if we come to think of like all the regionalist tradition that has given the sertão a very characteristic shape, but at the same time that allows for many variations.
Where does all this leave indigenous people, Victoria?
So in the case of Grande Sertão Veredas, not so much, but if you think of the case of, well, I would not even say just Amazonian fiction, or rather intellectual production about the Amazon, across Brazil, you have, well, you can think of like a 19th century novels from José de Alencar that already bring indigenous history in different ways, right? Of course, many of them pretty controversial ones, but yeah, but if you think about the fiction produced about the Amazon today, I think that there has been increasingly a tendency to think about the specificity of those peoples and like the diversity, the demographic, the cultural, the social diversity that we can find, and that goes much further, goes much beyond than this type of easy opposition that terms such as the sertão, or we could say the rainforest, invite us to consider in a first moment.
Yeah. A question. I don't know, Victoria, do you want to say something? Add something?
I was just going to say that, yeah, indigenous cultures are not really very present in Grande Sertão Veredas, but there are other moments in which they very much are in Guimarães Rosa's work, and I would recommend especially the long short story or the short novella Meu Tio e o Arete, that was translated as The Jaguar, that engages very strongly with Tupi-inspired vocabulary, and it's absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Victoria. We have two questions. One from Michael McMahon. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, first off, thank you for being here and speaking with us. My question has to do with, I guess you were speaking about visibility and sort of the imagination of the sertão in the cultural landscape, and how did, I suppose, the government explain or get around the idea of that, the interconnectedness with the people, with the landscape, because you talked about resettlement projects that went into the creation of the national parks. So I guess how important were the sertaneros for that imagined space or that national space?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, so this is a question that can have different answers depending on the historical scope that you consider. If you think more in the context of the Grande Sertão Veredas National Park, well, you know, since the 1960s and 70s, the government has been sponsoring the how to say, the settlement, no, the instalação, or the arrival of migrants from the southern states of Brazil. And, you know, they would receive a piece of, like, some land. And the idea was to kind of develop this region, right? And the term development remains kind of a spectral presence across most of these initiatives. And then you start having extensive monoculture, deforestation, and a large use of the water resources, especially between the strong use of two rivers in that region of the park. And the park was created as a way also of preserving the water supply in the region and protecting these two rivers. But, you know, it also used this imaginary provided by Grande Sertão Veredas. So we have here the veredeiros, most of whom were there already before the arrival of the migrants from the south, and they started being displaced because in many cases they did not have the title of the land. So already decades before the park was created. But then when the creation of the park took place, you know, for a long time, the park was almost a virtual creation. Very little had been done to actually transform it into a national park. And it is across, you know, the 1990s, but more strongly in the early 2000s, the first decade of the first 21st century, that you start having a larger displacement of the populations who lived in the park. And they were offered the option of having some land in an area that is a bit farther away, that, as I said, does not have such a good water supply, or having a monetary indemnification. The vast majority of them opted for having land in these other areas called Formoso. And currently, or at least the last time I checked that, there were still a few families living in the side of the park that is in the state of Bahia, because they had the title of the land, because most of those families, they did not really. And there was a farm, a larger farm there called the Fazenda do Feltrin, that from anecdotal information that I have gotten, received a larger indemnification, comparatively speaking, than the veredeiros who had been living there. So this is the more like a localized story of the area of the park. But if you think about the obsession about integrating the sertões as a project of as a national project that you know, was present, like the creation of a capital, the capital of Brasília, not with this name, but it was present since the 18th century, and then across the empire in the 19th century. And in the late 19th century, the beginning of the Republic, you start having some expeditions. So the whole creation of Brasília was really in itself one of the main events aimed at bringing the civilization, so to speak, in developing these areas and bringing some kind of economic and political integration of them. So it's interesting to read Grande Sertão Veredas in conjunction with the creation of Brasília. And Guimarães Rosa also has short stories that talk about the building of Brasília, in the sense that, yeah, Brasília almost functions as this kind of event that was not very far away from the present of Riobaldo's narration in temporal times, at least in a chronological sense, but that kind of points out to this accelerated potential extinction of the sertões.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Each question is you want to keep talking, but let's move to the next question, and then we can go back. So Beatriz is asking, well, thank you so much for your talk. I would like to ask you about something you talked about at the beginning. You were talking about how to enter in this space of the certain in the book. Is like entering into a labyrinth. I think you said you have an article about that. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Thank you, Beatriz, for your question. Yeah, one of the things that I think most readers of Grande Sertão Veredas will face is, you know, that this sense of profusion and kind of confusion that is present in the reading of this book. As I said, it is a long novel with many different characters, with a huge displacement, you know, like many different localities across the book, spanning 3 states, and many anecdotes and stories that exist inside stories, you know, and a story of war and a no more erotic love story, you know, and you have like so many different novels inside this novel, and this has puzzled critics almost right from the beginning. But what I propose is that the Grande Sertão Veredas kind of tries to materialize in the experience of reading this sense of profusion, this sense of labyrinth, the sense of like being lost, the sense of infiniteness that the sertão itself, that is the way through which the sertão is itself defined. So there is this kind of also a material form of mimesis, if you will, which is what I discuss in this article that came out in the Luso-Brazilian Review last year, in which I talk about, how this is a novel that tries to bring to the very materiality of the book, which also brings us to the experience of reading as we deal with this materiality, the characteristics or the experience of being in the sertão. So and then you have like many moments in which Riobaldo keeps defining and redefining what the sertão is. And he says the sertão is the size of the world. The sertão is everywhere. The sertão is like a tiger. You cannot really control it. So there is really this act of like keep bringing back the sertão in a way that is very much akin to the type of relationship that we readers can establish with this text. Thank you, Javier.
Yeah. I think that's the reference that you will be, maybe you're interested in that. Also, Victoria has an interesting article that I have mentioned in class about how the word sertão was used in like early modern Portuguese text, and then you can see how this is not a word that like was invented in the 19th century in Brazil, but it was a word with a strong and important history in colonizing missions, but the sense is the one that Victoria was mentioning, was discussing before, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's interesting to reread like the 20th century literature under the light of this larger history, because the sertão is a term that appears again and again in Brazilian literature in the 20th century. Most of the times not in the specific ways, like with the existential and mystical connotations that Guimarães Rosa gives to it, but nevertheless have like a strong impact in the literary imagination in Brazil in the 20th century. And I think it's I wanted to excavate more the longer history that has led to the importance of this term, or at least to the connotations that this term would take in the 20th century.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to keep reading. Thank you very much for the question. We have many interesting questions. And Maria is asking, Maria is also here, is asking, do you make some connections in terms of madness? I guess, if I understand this idea, this profusion in the language, right? And this profuse territory and space. Can you relate that with madness or some kind of particular mental state, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
So we have seen this in some previous text about the Sertão, about the Pampas. So maybe Maria is also making this some connections with the previous discussions.
Okay. Yeah, I don't discuss so much specifically in terms of madness, the way I talk about the Sertão, but it is definitely very present in Guimarães Rosa's work, and in a way that, does imply some connection between, this kind of hallucinogenic reality of the Sertão, right? And forms of individual madness. So what was I gonna say? Yeah, Guimarães Rosa, he has many other stories in, like, for example, in Corpo de Baile, such as O Recado do Morro, in which you have a connection between this kind of ability to listen to the Sertão madness and some kind of ability to see things that other people don't see. And there are other characters in his work that could be characterized as mad, and that do carry some kind of larger truth that sometimes is more connected to the very idea of the Sertão, and sometimes is not. But for sure, the idea of creating this very profuse labyrinthine work that kind of invites us to lose ourselves, and it's hard to keep control of where the episodes are, what happens when. This is something that does have some kind of maddening effect, I could say. And of course, in Grande Sertão Veredas itself, well, I don't want to give you spoilers, but the possible pact with the devil that Riobaldo might have made, you have to read the novel to discover if he did or not, or if he could or not. But that, has a lot of an individual conflict about whether he can believe in himself and in the pact or not. That also brings a lot of psychological issues. I don't know if I talk too much about it, because I'll just read the novel.
We'll go back to that. And we're here, I thank Gustavo Prieto is suggesting giving us a link where we can read the Meu Tio Jaguarete in Portuguese. There's another question, Michael asking, where do you see the future of these conservationist projects, taking into consideration the apparent desire of the very explicit desire of this president to continue and even increase deforestation and extraction of resources in Amazonia? Does this apply to the Sertão as well? We're entering in these waters.
Yeah, which are very much needed. Thank you for your question. So there is a larger historical process here. The Amazon started being the major example of a rainforest that is a place that must be conserved, right? And this is a process that has existed for a few decades, mostly from the 1980s and even more in the 2000s. So you have so many international initiatives aiming at conserving the Amazon, which are of course extremely necessary. But as a counterpoint, there is also a relative lack of attention towards other regions. And one of them is the Cerrado, this biome in which most of Guimarães Rosa's work is set, which is a drier, more like a savanna type of vegetation, that of course has many rivers, has a very vast biodiversity, but that has been way less appreciated both nationally and internationally as a place that must be preserved. So to a certain extent, the huge amount of attention that the Amazon has received has been detrimental to the level of attention that the Cerrado has received. And the rates of deforestation in the Cerrado I don't know exactly if now, but traditionally in the 2000s, and since the 1990s, and you have the right of agribusiness in Brazil, the rates of deforestation in the Cerrado have been higher than in the Amazon. And we really can foresee like the end of the Cerrado, with the characteristics that have defined it in a way that fortunately the Amazon is still hopefully many years away. So this is to bring some perspective, about not only the environmental diversity of Brazil, but the diversity of the levels of attention and engagement and activism that different regions have received. So the Cerrado, but at the same time, there have been many conservation units created for the Cerrado, and there are increasingly more projects of conservation. So when we think about Bolsonaro and about these projects, well, there is so much that could be said that is even hard to begin, right? But to stay within the topic of this talk, if you think about the connection between environment and culture and how cultural objects can be somehow pieces in broader environmental initiatives, it's interesting to note that Bolsonaro's government is not merely against the environment, it's also against culture. It's also against, for example, the resources for the conservation of the Brazilian Cinemateca, right? It is also against all the programs of the humanities and social sciences. It is really against knowledge, both academic and artistic. It's really like a federal project of extinguishing federal sponsorship and funding for cultural projects and for the academia. And we're talking about, putting the environment and putting cultural production as kind of two sides of the same imaginary opponent that Bolsonaro has identified in his crusade, his crazy crusade, right? So it's not, I think that, when we think about these projects, I think they in fact are especially important in the moment we live, in the sense that they bring this interconnectedness between a cultural imagination and environmental realities in a way that emphasizes the need to rethink and to resist Bolsonaro's policies, both for the environment and for culture in Brazil. They really make this connection that is more and more necessary.
Thank you, Victoria. Thanks, Michael, for the question too. It's so discouraging sometimes, but well, hopefully things will change sooner than later. Do we have any other questions, any comments that you would like to ask? Well, here's this one. That happens. It's my punishment for asking for questions. Here's a question by Maria, and she's asking obrigado, because she's learning Portuguese. Victoria, for being here with us today. I want to share the following quote from the introduction in order to introduce my question. So she quotes from your work: "More than being taken as mirrors of what reality is, in specific contexts, such works provide images of what reality should be." And I think you also mentioned this before, right? Following this line, what space or what identities are we really getting to know when we read a work? The one that is or the one that should be? I wonder, in the case that we are discussing here, if literature, in particular if fictional environments, prescribe how a space has to be understood and experienced, or if on the contrary, it describes how it is understood and how it is experienced. Also, I ask thinking about this other quote from the intro, in particular circumstances, literary works not only present specific environments, but also help forge and negotiate public perception of these environments. To what extent is this negotiation also distortion?
Thank you very much, Maria. Great questions. Let me go back to them. Yeah, so it's interesting that you talk about prescribing, because I do talk about Mimesis in a case as this one as being prescriptive. We have to take into consideration that when you talk about the fictional work, and especially about the fictional work so profuse as Grande Sertão Veredas, right, with so many plots and subplots and places and characters and all that, there are many ways of approaching the novel, right? So many people, I mean, the Sertão is a bit of an unescapable framework in which the novel is set, but there are many ways of highlighting very crucial parts of the novel that do not really appear in these projects. For example, we were talking about the pact with the devil. It is mostly absent because, you know, why would a touristic circuit tell you, hey, you can make a pact with the devil if you want? It's not really interesting, right? It's much nicer to say that you can go on a literary hike. And same goes for a national park. And for example, the homoerotic relationship that Riobaldo has with Diadorim is also another component that is pretty much excluded from the way these projects read Grande Sertão Veredas. Does it mean that they are misreading it? Well, I would like to see these aspects more included. However, you know, the work is open, right? They are using this work in a certain way that is not necessarily the path of reading, the path of like the more aesthetic path. And this is why I talk about the agency of this work at the end, not necessarily as an aesthetic object, like when we approach the Grande Sertão Veredas from the viewpoint of these initiatives. We are not really thinking about all the literary complexity of Grande Sertão Veredas. We are thinking about how Grande Sertão Veredas became an object imbued of a certain symbolic power that we can, in a very specific way, interfere on these realities, right? Does it mean that the role of Grande Sertão Veredas is merely to prescribe how the Sertão should be? Of course not. It remains a novel that can, and in most cases, is read without these projects in mind, right? And that keeps these many plots and subplots that should not like prescribe to us this view. What I'm talking more is about how these projects do use some parts of the novel or some understandings of the novels, geographical and environmental imagination, as ways of justifying conservation and the permanence of a certain imagination attached to Guimarães Rosa's work. And this negotiation, to go back to the end of your question, especially when you think about this novel in relation to these projects, yes, there is a distortion, not only in the way the novel, the projects cannot really imitate the novel as they wish, but also there is a distortion in the way the novel is read. There is, as I said, this very kind of partial and a view of like a selection of the aspects of the Sertão that are interesting for a project such a national park water management project. I don't know if I answered your question. Feel free to ask more if you want. There is also a comment by Christine here about Ailton Krenak's Ideias para Adiar o Fim do Mundo, Ideas to Postpone the End of the World. Thank you for bringing, yeah, Ailton Krenak is one of the main thinkers in Brazil today, and an indigenous thinker, not an Amazonian one. He in fact comes from Minas Gerais, the same state as Guimarães Rosa, right? Yeah, I have read this work. I think it is fantastic. And in fact, if I can make a little advertisement here, we are still in the process of editing a volume. Oh, you have it now, nice. That in which we hope to include another text by him in which he talks about environmental conservation and the production of knowledge in the universities that I find fascinating. I think it is available online, but only in Portuguese, and I think his texts must be translated into English, and together with other authors such as Davi Kopenawa, we really have like an alternative way of not only thinking about climate change, about deforestation, but also of naming those terms, right? Of like thinking about how an alternative vocabulary can bring about alternative forms of thinking about the predicaments of developmentalism and deforestation that we face today.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you for all the questions. We are actually running out of time, so we have, we already run. But I didn't know it was 90 minutes. So we are out of time. But I think Adrián Pérez Melgosa has a question, and then we can, if anyone has a question, we can ask one more question, and then we're done. Okay, Adrián, you can go ahead.
I really want to thank you for a wonderful talk, and really has made us thought in so many different directions. And thank you for bringing up this issue of how fiction and reality can relate in different ways. I kept thinking about your initial definition of the Certau in referential terms as something that is dynamic, as something that is always there in relation to some colonizing effort or in relation to some progress. But I was also thinking about Guimarães himself having a relational understanding of it as something that is like a projection of an internal vision that he has to. So he sees what he has to, or what he has. And in that sense, at some moment in these initiatives, and I don't know if it's fair to say this, you'll tell me, that relational becomes referential. It becomes a real space. It becomes, this is the Certau, or this is the park, or this is the. So in that, I want to ask you, when did that shift happen? And what is, from your point of view, the importance of that shift? From some perspective, one would say that the mere existence of that referential clear meaning for that has in a way killed the Certau that Guimarães or has made it impossible to happen. But at the same time, you very clearly show that it's giving some kind of life to a notion of it. So that step from the referential from the relational to the referential, when do you notice that it happens, and what is the import of it? What is the significance of it? Significance.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so Guimarães Rosa, he's an interesting figure because he was born in Cordisburgo, which is a relatively small town in Minas Gerais, closer to Belo Horizonte, the capital of the state. But then he was a doctor, he traveled a lot in those areas, but then he became a diplomat. And he lived in many different places. He lived in Germany during the Second World War, for example. He lived in Paris, and then he lived in Rio. And even though he went back to the Sertão for some trips, he always was like this person living in those big urban centers. But the Sertão remains for him the space, he calls it compromisso do coração, né? The literature, but very entangled with the Sertão. It's like a commitment of the heart. And for him, literature, Sertão, and life are very much interconnected. And the Sertão is often for him this space of the metaphysics, that in his way of thinking about metaphysics is what is beyond reason, is what is beyond rationality. So it is really like this space of imagination, this space of magic, this space of mystique. And well, these projects, if I understand your question, you're asking whether these projects bring this kind of very effective dimension of Guimarães Rosa when they kind of bring the term the Sertão and the imagination to Sertão to the referential areas where they take place, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was meaning, that it seems that it's this expansive notion, boundless, but that the initiatives themselves have to tame it in order to make it manageable and have an effect. So I was wondering if there is some tension there that you perceive, or actually, and when did that happen? If there's a historical moment when, the referential takes over and becomes the way to understand this area rather than the Guimarães way.
Well, I think it's hard to pinpoint a historical moment. I mean, what in fact happens is that many of these projects, they bring back the term sertão to areas where today the word is not very often used, So if you go to most of the cities in the touristic circuit, and if you ask, hey, is the sertão here? People say, no, this is not sertão. This is a city, or this is a farm. This is not a sertão, right? And the sertão remains always elsewhere, right? And these projects, they make a lot of use, not specifically of those types of affirmations of Guimarães Rosa in interviews, but of the love he had for the sertão, of this strong affective connection, as a way of making the sertão a term that, can be everywhere because it is more than a geographical location. It's also like this kind of rural imagination of the past. And I talked about Raymond Williams in the beginning, and I think his work works well, in terms of thinking about this kind of a pastoral, idyllic past, in which the sertão can be applied in a very malleable way, Yeah, and in terms of history, the sertão becomes more attached to the area of the Northeast, mostly at the turn of the 20th century. The Canudos War was important to in this long process, but it remained pretty relational across the good chunk of the 20th century.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I think there are more questions, but we don't have time, and I don't want to. When I ask for questions, I get this great labyrinthic to stay in the topic questions. So I thank the Humanities Institute again, Adrienne and Adrian. I thank the public for being here. I thank the students for the great questions, for asking for their interest and their questions.